What if the story of intelligence on Earth begins earlier than we are taught to imagine? Not earlier by centuries or even by millennia, but by spans of time so deep that language itself begins to soften at the edges. What if something once learned how to observe the stars, to calculate, to remember, only to be unremembered in turn? History often presents humanity as a sudden light in a long darkness, yet darkness, when examined closely, is rarely empty. And, before you allow your body to settle fully into this quiet moment, take a very small pause to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in these thoughts makes you want to remain a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you're listening. I am always curious about the small points of light drifting together through this night. The Earth is old in a way that resists intuition. 4.5 billion years of shifting crusts, collapsing oceans, migrating continents. Against this scale, the entirety of recorded human history occupies a space thinner than a breath. Agriculture appears only moments ago, writing even later, and modern technological society, barely a flicker. The question is not whether intelligence could have existed earlier. The question is why we assume it could not. Geology teaches that the planet repeatedly erases itself. Mountain ranges grind down into sand, seas advance and retreat. Entire ecosystems vanish beneath ice or lava or sediment. In such a world, absence of evidence is not reassurance, it is the expected outcome. A civilization built before the current configuration of continents would not announce itself easily. Steel rusts, concrete fractures, satellites fall. Even our own cities, if abandoned, would soften into soil within a few tens of thousands of years. Given enough time, memory does not just fade, it dissolves. This is where unease enters. The oldest known human structures already strain conventional timelines. Monumental stonework appears suddenly, with no clear developmental lineage. Precision seems to precede experimentation. In some cases, the knowledge required to shape and align massive stones arrives fully formed, then diminishes rather than improves. Progress, instead of rising, occasionally seems to retreat. Historians often explain this through lost techniques or cultural disruptions, but the pattern repeats often enough to provoke quieter questions. Mythology, long dismissed as ornament or allegory, becomes strange when approached as residue rather than fiction. Stories from cultures separated by oceans speak of earlier ages that ended abruptly. Floods that reset the world. Teachers who arrived after catastrophe, carrying fragments of prior knowledge. These are not proofs, they are signals. Persistent, cross-cultural signals that something was believed to have been lost, and belief, even when mistaken, usually points toward a pressure in the past that demanded explanation. Evolutionary biology introduces another tension. Intelligence is costly. It requires energy, social complexity, long childhoods, and fragile dependency networks. Yet once it emerges, it reshapes environments rapidly. The leap from tool use to symbolic thought to abstract reasoning appears compressed in our own lineage. Too compressed, some argue, to be purely gradual. Others counter that rarity does not imply repetition. Still, the silence remains. If intelligence arose once, why not twice? Separated by deep time, separated by disaster. There is also the matter of where evidence would hide. Advanced societies do not leave behind glowing labels. They leave altered landscapes, unusual isotopic signatures, anomalous distributions of materials. Most of these signals would be indistinguishable from natural processes after enough time, especially if that time includes ice ages, tectonic recycling, and oceanic burial. The ocean, covering most of the planet, is also its most efficient archive destroyer. Human history prefers clean origins. They are easier to teach, easier to defend, more comforting. To imagine ourselves as the first thinkers, the first observers, the first to wonder, places us at the center of the narrative. But comfort has never been a reliable guide to truth. and history, when examined honestly, is full of interruptions rather than smooth ascents. Perhaps intelligence is not a single flame passed forward, but a recurring phenomenon, appearing when conditions allow, extinguished when conditions withdraw. Perhaps the question is not whether others came before us, but how many times the planet has already forgotten. If that is the case, then the ruins we search for may not look like ruins at all. They may look like ordinary stone, ordinary sediment, ordinary myth. They may be everywhere, disguised by familiarity, waiting not to be discovered but to be recognized. And if recognition itself is fragile, dependent on what we are willing to question, then the greatest barrier to understanding may not be time or erosion or catastrophe. It may be certainty. What, then, would history look like if certainty were the first thing to dissolve? If intelligence did emerge once before, then time itself becomes the first obstacle to accepting it. Deep time is not merely long, it is actively hostile to human intuition. Millions of years collapse into abstract numbers, stripped of texture, stripped of lived meaning. We say 100,000 years as if it were a stretch of memory, when in reality it is an abyss. Against that abyss, the rise of Homo sapiens appears not as destiny, but as coincidence. The official narrative of intelligence assumes rarity bordering on impossibility. One planet, one species, one narrow window. And yet the Earth has provided habitable conditions not for thousands, but for billions of years. Complex life has existed for more than half that time, oceans stabilized, atmospheres oxygenated, ecological systems matured, collapsed, and reassembled again and again. To imagine that cognition capable of abstraction and planning could only arise once, and only now, requires a degree of faith rarely acknowledged. Statistical reasoning complicates the story further. If intelligence is an adaptive advantage, even a fragile one, then evolutionary pressure should test it repeatedly. Not continuously, perhaps not successfully every time, but intermittently, experimentally. Nature rarely commits to a single trial. Limbs, eyes, flight, and social behavior all emerged independently across different lineages. Intelligence, defined loosely as the ability to model reality and act upon that model, does not appear exempt from this pattern. It appears instead constrained, limited by energy costs and environmental volatility. And volatility is the constant companion of deep time. The fossil record reveals not a gentle progression, but a sequence of interruptions. Mass extinctions punctuate Earth's history like abrupt silences. The Permian event erased the majority of life. The end Cretaceous impact ended entire evolutionary trajectories in a matter of days. These were not rare anomalies. They were structural features of the planet's story. In such a context, long-lived technological societies would not be expected to persist. They would be expected to vanish. This is where duration becomes unsettling. Human civilization, as we define it, has existed for roughly 10,000 years. Industrial civilization for less than 300. The window during which we might leave durable, unmistakable traces is vanishingly small. Extend this reasoning backward, and the absence of clear evidence no longer argues against prior intelligence. It aligns with expectations. The Earth is not a museum. It is a recycling system. Consider the fate of our own materials. Plastics fragment. Metals corrode. Even nuclear waste, often imagined as eternal, becomes geologically subtle over deep time. Concrete crumbles into calcium-rich dust. Glass devitrifies. Electronics dissolve into trace elements. After 1 million years, only anomalies remain. Chemical whispers rather than structures. After 10 million, even those whispers blur into the background noise of geology. If an earlier intelligent species arose during a previous stable climate interval, its traces would be subjected to ice sheets, sea level rise, tectonic drift, and subduction. Entire continents have been destroyed and rebuilt since complex life began. Oceanic crust, where coastal civilizations would most likely concentrate, is systematically recycled every few 100 million years, what survives is not what mattered most to those who lived, but what happened to be sheltered by chance. This raises an uncomfortable asymmetry. We look for cities, machines, monuments, because these are what we value. But intelligence does not require permanence. It requires coordination, memory, and problem-solving within a given environment. A society adapted to conditions unlike our own might leave behind no architecture recognizable to us. It might favor organic materials, transient structures, or technologies that dissolve completely when maintenance ceases. Absence, again, proves nothing. There is also the question of tempo. Human intelligence did not emerge gradually across the entire hominin lineage. It appears to accelerate suddenly. Symbolic thought, art, complex language, and advanced tools cluster tightly in time. This compression unsettles simple evolutionary narratives. Explanations exist, of course. Population density, cultural transmission, feedback loops. But they all acknowledge something unusual. A threshold crossed, a switch flipped. If thresholds exist, they may have been crossed before. Ancient texts, when read without modern expectations, occasionally reflect an awareness of deep cycles. Not scientific chronologies, but intuitions of recurrence. Ages of the world, repeated destructions, knowledge lost and partially regained. These accounts are often dismissed as metaphor, yet metaphor itself tends to crystallize around persistent experiences. Cultures remember what hurts them. They mythologize what they cannot prevent. The idea that intelligence could rise, flourish briefly, and be extinguished without descendants challenges our sense of continuity. We prefer to imagine ourselves as heirs, not orphans. But deep time does not guarantee inheritance, it permits forgetting. Entire evolutionary experiments end without legacy. The trilobites ruled the oceans for hundreds of millions of years, then vanished. Duration did not save them. If intelligence arose before, it may not have resembled us closely enough to be easily recognized. Cognitive sophistication does not demand humanoid form. It demands perception, communication, and adaptation. We are biased toward seeing ourselves as the template. But evolution has never favored templates. It favors sufficiency. And so the silence stretches backward. Not as proof of emptiness, but as a canvas upon which certainty has been painted too confidently. The longer one sits with the numbers, the less stable the official story feels. Billions of years invite more than one awakening, more than one attempt at understanding. If intelligence is not unique, then humanity is not the beginning of the story. And if humanity is not the beginning, then the urgency to listen, to the ground, to the myths, to the anomalies, becomes something more than curiosity. It becomes responsibility. Because if intelligence has already vanished once before, then the question waiting beneath all others is not who came before us, but how long we're allowed to remain. The question of where evidence might sleep leads inevitably toward water. Not metaphorical water, but the literal oceans that now cover most of the planet's memory. Sea levels have not been constant. They rise and fall like a slow breath, taken over tens of thousands of years. During the last glacial maximum, coastlines extended far beyond their present limits. Vast tracts of land, now submerged, were once habitable, temperate and stable for long periods of time. If intelligence flourished earlier, these drowned margins would have been the most attractive places to exist. Archaeology, by necessity, is terrestrial. It studies what remains accessible. The ocean floor, despite covering more than 2/3 of Earth's surface, remains largely unexplored. Not because of lack of interest, but because of difficulty. Pressure, darkness, and scale conspire against systematic excavation. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about much of our own seabed. This imbalance quietly shapes what we believe is possible. When early humans expanded outward, they followed water. Rivers, deltas, and coasts were arteries of migration and exchange. There is no reason to believe earlier intelligences, if they existed, would have behaved differently. Shorelines provide food, transport, and climatic moderation. Yet these are precisely the regions most vulnerable to erasure. Rising seas do not preserve, they scatter, crush, and bury. The submerged landscape of Doggerland in the North Sea offers a brief, unsettling glimpse of what has been lost even within known human history. Once a broad plain connecting Britain to continental Europe, it supported forests, animals, and human communities. Today it lies beneath shallow water, its traces recovered only incidentally through fishing nets and sonar surveys. If such a landscape can disappear so completely in a few thousand years, then deeper losses become easier to imagine. Far older submerged plateaus exist elsewhere: the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, the Sahel Shelf near Australia, and the Bering Land Bridge that once linked Asia and the Americas, all were exposed during lower sea levels. These regions experienced repeated flooding and exposure cycles. Each cycle erased surface evidence and redistributed sediments. Whatever stories were written, they were overwritten repeatedly, not by intent, but by physics. Some underwater structures provoke controversy precisely because they resist easy classification. Natural formations and human-modified landscapes often blur together under erosion. Straight lines appear where geology fractures predictably. Terraces form through wave action as easily as through construction. This ambiguity becomes fertile ground for both speculation and dismissal. Yet ambiguity itself is not disproof. It is an invitation to caution, both against belief and against denial. The deeper problem lies not in any single structure, but in expectation. We search for permanence where none is promised. An advanced society does not guarantee monumental stonework. It guarantees only adaptation to its context. A culture optimized for coastal living might leave behind tools of wood, fiber, shell, and bone, materials that decay almost entirely under marine conditions. After enough time, what remains is not form, but pattern. Geology does record patterns, though interpreting them requires restraint. Isotopic anomalies, unexpected concentrations of certain elements, disturbances inconsistent with known natural processes, these are the faintest of fingerprints. Some researchers have proposed that future geologists studying our own era would struggle to identify industrial civilization without contextual knowledge. The Anthropocene signal, while real, is subtle when stretched across millions of years. This reframes the question of proof. If evidence of our own society would be difficult to detect in deep time, why do we expect earlier societies to announce themselves clearly? The demand for unmistakable artifacts becomes less scientific and more psychological. It reflects a need for certainty rather than an assessment of likelihood. There's also the matter of timing. Stable interglacial periods, long stretches of relative climatic calm, have occurred before. Some lasted tens of thousands of years. These windows provided opportunities for complex ecological relationships to develop. They were not static, but they were forgiving enough to allow continuity. If intelligence requires not perfection, but persistence, then these intervals would have been sufficient. Yet every interval ended. Ice returned, seas rose, deserts expanded. The transition between stability and collapse is rarely gentle. It is disruptive, chaotic, and selective in what it spares. In such transitions, oral memory fractures first. Writing, if it exists, becomes meaningless without readers. Knowledge collapses inward, becoming ritual, then myth, then silence. This is where drowned landscapes intersect with ancient stories. Flood narratives appear across cultures not as isolated inventions, but as recurring responses to collective loss. They speak less about water itself and more about rupture, about a world that no longer exists and cannot be fully explained. Myth in this sense, is not an alternative to history. It is what history becomes when evidence sinks beyond reach. Modern exploration technology has only begun to touch these submerged margins. Sonar maps, remotely operated vehicles, and sediment cores offer hints rather than answers. What they reveal most clearly is scale. The sheer amount of territory now underwater dwarfs what we have studied on land. To assume emptiness is not cautious, it is convenient, and convenience has always shaped historical confidence. What can be reached becomes what is remembered. What lies beyond reach becomes hypothetical, then implausible, then ignored. Over time, absence hardens into doctrine. The map becomes the territory even when the map is incomplete. If earlier intelligences existed along ancient coasts, their world would now lie beneath kilometers of water and sediment. Their stories would not rise to the surface intact. They would surface as fragments, distortions, and questions that refuse to disappear entirely. Questions embedded in legends, questions encoded in anomalies, questions that feel strangely persistent. The ocean does not guard secrets deliberately. It simply does what it has always done: move, grind, and cover. But in doing so, it forces a reckoning with humility. It reminds us that history is not missing because it never happened, but because we arrived too late and learned too slowly how to listen. And so the silence beneath the waves remains, not empty, not speaking, simply waiting for methods we have not yet perfected and for questions we have not yet fully dared to ask. When attention turns from landscapes to objects, unease takes a more tangible shape. Artifacts carry expectations with them. They are meant to belong somewhere specific in time, nested neatly within a sequence of development. Stone becomes metal. Simple tools become complex ones. Rough edges smooth themselves through repetition. This is the rhythm history prefers, and yet, scattered throughout the record, there are interruptions, objects that appear without sufficient preparation, or appear too early, or appear already refined. Archaeology often treats these moments as local puzzles rather than global questions. A tool slightly out of place is attributed to misdating. A structure that seems too precise is explained as coincidence or underestimated skill. In most cases, such explanations are reasonable. Human ingenuity is frequently underestimated, especially when filtered through modern assumptions about primitive cultures. But reason begins to strain when the pattern repeats across geography and time. Some stone constructions display levels of precision that seem oddly isolated. Techniques appear fully realized, then vanish. Later cultures inherit the results, but not the methods. The stones remain, but the knowledge dissolves. This inversion, where mastery precedes experimentation, sits uncomfortably within linear models of progress. It suggests not a gradual ascent, but a moment of access followed by loss. Toolmaking offers similar quiet disturbances. Certain stone tools appear suddenly in the archaeological record with little evidence of earlier transitional forms. They are efficient, symmetrical, and standardized, implying shared knowledge and cultural transmission. Then, just as abruptly, they disappear. The usual explanation points to population collapse or environmental pressure. But disappearance does not explain origin. It only explains interruption. There are also marks that do not announce themselves as tools or structures at all. Grooves, patterns, and geometric forms etched into stone surfaces long before the cultures traditionally credited with symbolic abstraction. These are often classified cautiously, hovering between natural and intentional. The hesitation is understandable. To declare intention is to imply mind, and to imply mind is to reopen the question of when mind first learned to leave a trace. Dating methods, precise as they are, rely on context. Remove context, and certainty thins. Artifacts displaced by erosion, floods, or tectonic movement can appear older or younger than they truly are. Yet even allowing for generous margins of error, some objects persistently resist comfortable placement. They sit at the edges of timelines, quietly questioning the neatness of the story. What makes these anomalies unsettling is not their mystery alone, but their ordinariness. They are not miraculous machines or impossible technologies. They are stones shaped deliberately, surfaces aligned carefully, materials chosen with apparent understanding of stress, balance, and durability. These are the signatures not of fantasy, but of problem-solving minds working within constraints. Critics often argue that the human mind is biased toward pattern seeking, that we impose meaning where none exists. This is true, but the opposite bias also exists, the tendency to minimize anomalies to protect existing frameworks. Science advances by balancing these impulses, not by surrendering entirely to one. Dismissing every inconvenient object as coincidence is as unscientific as embracing every coincidence as proof. Consider how little of human activity survives even a few thousand years. Most tools were organic. Most structures were temporary. What endures is what happened to be built from stone, buried quickly, or abandoned under unusual conditions. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a scattering of survivors. To reconstruct a civilization from such remnants is like inferring a language from a handful of surviving letters. This fragility reframes the question of sophistication. An advanced society does not need to leave behind complex machinery to demonstrate intelligence. It needs only to solve its own problems effectively. If those problems did not require heavy industry, large-scale mining, or permanent monuments, then its traces would be minimal. Intelligence optimized for sustainability would appear almost invisible to us. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that some evidence has been misclassified not out of malice, but out of expectation. When an object does not fit, it is often shelved under unknown or natural variation. Over time, these classifications accumulate quietly, rarely revisited unless a new framework emerges. Knowledge, like sediment, settles according to prevailing currents. Historical memory offers a parallel. Cultures forget techniques faster than they forget stories. Methods vanish, myths remain. A people may no longer know how their ancestors achieved certain feats, but they remember that the feats occurred. Over generations, explanation gives way to reverence. Engineering becomes legend. Precision becomes magic. And eventually even the legend thins into silence. This does not mean every ancient mystery points toward a lost intelligence. It means that intelligence leaves behind uneven footprints. Some are deep, some are fleeting, and some are mistaken for natural marks because we are not looking for minds where we expect none. The danger lies not in asking whether some artifacts suggest an earlier cognitive presence, but in assuming the answer must be no to preserve comfort. Comfort has always been a poor historian. It smooths edges, resolves tension prematurely, and rewards closure over curiosity. If earlier intelligences existed, their material culture would not announce itself loudly. It would whisper through inconsistencies, through moments where skill appears unearned, through techniques remembered without being understood, through objects that seem to belong to no one because everyone arrived after they were made. These artifacts do not demand belief. They demand patience. They ask to be held lightly, examined without urgency, and allowed to trouble certainty without immediately replacing it. They are questions disguised as stones, and if stones can remember what minds have forgotten, then perhaps the record of intelligence is not absent at all. Perhaps it's simply quieter than we expected, waiting for a listener willing to hear uncertainty without rushing to fill the silence. Loss, when examined closely, is rarely singular. It arrives layered, compounded, disguised as normality. The Earth's history is not a steady accumulation of life and knowledge, but a sequence of resets, some subtle, some violent enough to redraw the planet's face. To consider earlier intelligences without considering catastrophe is to imagine memory without erosion. The geological record speaks softly but consistently of interruption. Ice ages advance not as gentle winters, but as continental-scale reorganizations. Sea levels fall by more than 100 meters, exposing plains and river systems, then rise again, drowning them without ceremony. Volcanic provinces erupt for centuries, dimming sunlight and poisoning air and water. Asteroid impacts arrive without warning, compressing millennia of consequence into hours. None of these events require malice. None require intention. They are simply what planets do. Human civilization has never experienced a full reset of this magnitude. We have known regional collapse, droughts, plagues, wars, but not planetary amnesia. This absence of experience quietly shapes our assumptions. We imagine continuity because we have been spared its opposite. But the past was not so gentle. The Younger Dryas stands as a reminder. A sudden return to near-glacial conditions after a period of warming, it disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Megafauna vanished, human cultures reorganized abruptly, settlement patterns shifted. Whatever explanations are favored, meltwater pulses, ocean circulation changes, extraterrestrial triggers, the result was the same. A world destabilized faster than social memory could adapt. If complexity existed before such an event, its collapse would have been swift. Complex systems fail unevenly. The most advanced elements are often the most fragile. Agriculture depends on climate stability. Writing depends on institutions. Science depends on continuity of education and record keeping. Remove these supports, and knowledge fragments rapidly. Techniques become rituals. Principles become stories. Precision dissolves into symbolism. Archaeology tends to focus on what survived, not on what was lost. This creates a bias toward durability rather than prevalence. Stone tools endure, so stone tools dominate narratives. Organic technologies vanish, so they are underrepresented. If an earlier intelligence favoured materials that decomposed, wood, fibre, resins, its technological footprint would be nearly invisible after catastrophe. What remains would be stone foundations without context, alignments without explanation, myths without manuals. Extinction events also reorder evolution. Species that once thrived vanish entirely, leaving no descendants to inherit behaviours or environments. Intelligence, if it arose in such a lineage, would not be passed forward. There would be no gradual handoff, no continuity of tradition, only silence. And silence, over deep time, is indistinguishable from absence. There is an unsettling humility in this realization. We often imagine intelligence as an inevitable climb, once begun, always advancing. But nature does not reward inevitability. It rewards adaptability. Intelligence that cannot adapt to rapid environmental change is a liability, not an advantage. Large brains require energy. Social complexity requires stability. When the world shifts too quickly, simpler strategies survive. This reframes intelligence as episodic rather than permanent, a temporary solution to temporary conditions. When those conditions vanish, so does the solution. There is no cosmic guarantee that awareness persists, only local opportunity. Ancient stories echo this pattern in distorted form. Ages end abruptly. Civilizations fall not gradually, but suddenly. Knowledge is lost overnight. Survivors remember fragments but cannot reconstruct the whole. These stories are often interpreted as moral allegories, but they also function as cognitive fossils, compressed memories of rapid disruption. Myth does not preserve facts, it preserves shock. Even today we underestimate how quickly knowledge can disappear. Languages die within generations. Techniques vanish when practitioners pass without apprentices. Entire fields become unintelligible when records decay. Multiply this by catastrophe, and the pace of forgetting accelerates beyond intuition. Within centuries, even advanced knowledge becomes irretrievable. Within millennia, its existence becomes doubtful. The temptation is to imagine that something as significant as an intelligent species would leave unmistakable scars, but catastrophe does not discriminate. It does not preserve what matters, it preserves what happens to be sheltered. A cave painting survives while a city dissolves. A myth endures while a library burns. Memory becomes selective not by design but by chance. This randomness complicates the search for predecessors. We look for continuity where there may have been none. We look for inheritance where extinction may have been total. And when we find nothing, we conclude nothing existed. Yet geology teaches a different lesson. Absence is the default outcome. There is also the possibility of multiple collapses layered atop one another. A society weakened by climate stress may survive only to be erased by impact. Another may endure impact but collapse under volcanic winter. Over hundreds of millions of years, these sequences repeat. The odds favour erasure over survival. The odds favour forgetting. If intelligence arose earlier, it would have faced a planet less stable than the one we inhabit now. Plate tectonics were faster, volcanism more intense, atmospheric composition less predictable. Stability, when it arrived, did so temporarily, long enough for complexity to bloom, but not long enough to ensure legacy. This does not diminish intelligence, it reframes it as fragile, a candle flickering in shifting wind, bright while it lasts, gone without trace when conditions change. To expect more is to project human hope onto geological indifference, and yet fragments persist, not as proof, but as disturbance, unexplained alignments, myths that refuse to align with known timelines, sudden appearances of knowledge without visible lineage. These do not confirm earlier intelligences, they simply resist closure. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is not that intelligence may have existed before, but that it may have existed many times, each rise erased so thoroughly that the next began believing itself alone, each awakening mistaking isolation for uniqueness. If that is so, then our own moment becomes precarious. Not because destruction is imminent, but because forgetting is easy. The earth does not remember for us. It waits, patient and unbothered, for memory to fail. And if catastrophe is not an exception but a rhythm, then the question waiting beneath all others is not whether intelligence came before, but whether it ever truly learned how to last. Memory does not disappear all at once. It thins. It frays at the edges before it breaks. Long before a society collapses materially, it collapses cognitively, losing the quiet, uncelebrated mechanisms that carry understanding from one mind to the next. Libraries burn dramatically, but apprenticeships fail silently. The true erosion of intelligence begins not with catastrophe, but with interruption. Complex knowledge depends on continuity. It is not enough to discover something once. It must be practiced, taught, and contextualized across generations. Remove any link in that chain, and the knowledge becomes inert. Techniques without theory degrade into rote behavior. Theory without application drifts into abstraction. Over time, both lose coherence. What remains is not understanding, but habit. Anthropologists have observed this process even in recent history. Isolated communities separated from broader networks often lose technologies their ancestors once used fluently. Navigation methods fade, craftsmanship simplifies, calendrical systems collapse into seasonal approximations. None of this requires violence, it requires only disconnection. Memory, like electricity, needs a circuit. If earlier intelligences existed, they would have been bound by the same constraints. Their knowledge would not have been encoded solely in objects but in relationships, between teachers and students, between rituals and environments, between symbols and shared assumptions. Once those relationships fractured, the knowledge would lose its reference. Words would remain, but their meanings would slide. Symbols would persist, but their functions would blur. This helps explain why advanced ideas sometimes appear embedded within later mythologies, stripped of their operational clarity. Astronomical cycles become gods, engineering feats become miracles, mathematical harmonies become sacred proportions. The content survives, but the context dissolves. Over time, explanation gives way to reverence, and reverence eventually gives way to repetition without comprehension. Oral cultures preserve memory differently than written ones, but they are not immune to loss. Oral transmission excels at preserving narrative structure, emotional resonance, and moral framing. It is less reliable at preserving technical precision. Numbers drift, timelines compress, causality reshapes itself to fit cultural needs. What endures is not accuracy, but meaning, and meaning is adaptable. Written records, often imagined as safeguards against forgetting, offer only partial protection. They require literacy, institutions, and stability. Without these, writing becomes decoration. Inscriptions remain unread. Texts persist without interpreters. Knowledge locked in symbols is no more alive than knowledge locked in stone. History provides sobering examples. Entire writing systems vanished, leaving inscriptions undeciphered for millennia. Mathematical treatises survived as fragments, referenced but not understood. Architectural techniques were replicated imperfectly, producing inferior imitations of earlier works. In each case, the loss was not total, but it was decisive. The fragility of memory suggests that even if earlier intelligences reached remarkable levels of understanding, their achievements would not necessarily accumulate. Progress is not guaranteed to be additive, it can be cyclical. Each cycle inherits fragments, misreads them, and builds anew, believing itself original. This pattern complicates how we interpret ancient knowledge. When early cultures demonstrate sudden sophistication in astronomy, geometry, or material science, it is tempting to attribute this to genius or coincidence, but it may also reflect inheritance without lineage, knowledge remembered without knowing where it came from, techniques preserved without understanding why they work. There is a particular unease in this idea. It suggests that intelligence does not always know itself, that minds can operate with tools whose origins they cannot explain, that civilizations can function atop foundations they did not lay. If so, then some of what we call innovation may actually be rediscovery, stripped of context and renamed. Memory loss also shapes identity. Societies define themselves through origin stories. These stories compress complexity into coherence. They explain where knowledge came from and why it matters. When true origins are inaccessible, stories fill the gap. Over time, these stories become sacred. To question them feels like erasure rather than inquiry. Institutions reinforce this process. Once a narrative stabilizes, it is taught, repeated, and protected. Alternative explanations are labeled speculative or disruptive, not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they threaten coherence. History becomes less about what happened and more about what must have happened for the present to make sense. This does not require conspiracy. It requires preference. Human systems favor continuity over uncertainty. They reward answers over questions. Over generations, this preference hardens into orthodoxy. Gaps in knowledge are smoothed over. Anomalies are contextualized until they stop feeling anomalous. And yet some gaps refuse to close. They persist as discomfort rather than contradiction. They surface in moments where memory feels incomplete, where something seems to be missing, but nothing obvious is gone. These are the moments that provoke speculation, not because evidence demands it, but because silence does. If intelligence arose before and was lost, its disappearance would not feel dramatic to those who followed. It would feel natural. The world would simply be as it is. Stones would exist without stories. Alignments would endure without explanations. Myths would echo events no longer anchored to time. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that memory loss is not an anomaly. It is the default. Preservation is the exception. Every generation forgets more than it remembers. Every civilization inherits only a fraction of what came before. Over deep time, this fraction approaches zero. If so, then the question is not whether earlier intelligences could have existed, but whether any intelligence can escape forgetting. The planet does not archive intentions, it archives processes. Minds leave behind no fossil record, only indirect consequences, most of which are eventually erased. And yet, forgetting is not absolute. Something always leaks through. A rhythm in myth, a ratio in architecture, a question that refuses to settle. These remnants do not point clearly backward, but they disturb the present. They remind us that knowledge can survive without memory, and memory can survive without understanding. If humanity stands atop layers of forgotten cognition, then our confidence becomes fragile, not because we know less than we think, but because what we know may not belong entirely to us. We may be inheritors who have mistaken inheritance for invention, and if that is true, then the silence behind us is not empty. It is crowded with minds that once asked similar questions, believed similar stories, and perhaps assumed, as we do now, that they were the first to wonder. Stories endure where records fail. When methods vanish and measurements drift, narratives remain, compressed, symbolic, and stubbornly persistent. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, certain stories recur with uncanny consistency. Worlds end suddenly. Knowledge is lost. Survivors emerge into a diminished age, carrying fragments they no longer fully understand. These stories are not archives in the modern sense. They are distortions shaped by fear, reverence, and time. And yet distortion does not imply invention. Myth has often been treated as the opposite of history, but this opposition is artificial. Myth is what history becomes when precision can no longer be maintained. It preserves sequence without scale, cause without mechanism, memory without chronology. In doing so, it offers a different kind of evidence, not proof, but persistence. When similar motifs arise independently, they suggest shared pressures rather than shared imagination. Flood narratives are the most obvious example, but they are not alone. Accounts of earlier ages populated by beings of greater knowledge appear repeatedly. Teachers arrive after catastrophe, bringing agriculture, law, or astronomy. These figures are often described not as creators, but as restorers. They do not invent civilization, they reintroduce it. This distinction matters. Restoration implies loss. In many traditions, the present world is framed as diminished, less ordered, less luminous, less connected to the cosmos than what came before. This is not nostalgia, it is cosmology. Time itself is imagined as degenerative. Each age inherits less clarity than the last. Knowledge becomes ritualized. Understanding becomes faith. Faith becomes repetition. Such frameworks are often dismissed as moral allegory, but they also function as cognitive scaffolding for explaining discontinuity. When a society cannot explain why it knows something, it explains why it no longer knows everything. The past becomes a container for what feels missing. Myth, in this sense, is an answer to epistemic anxiety. Consider the way ancient texts describe knowledge as having been revealed rather than discovered. Revelation implies prior existence. It suggests that truth is uncovered, not created. This orientation aligns poorly with modern narratives of progress, but it aligns closely with the experience of inheritance without origin. Knowledge appears fully formed, attributed to ancestors or gods, without developmental history. Symbolism further complicates the picture. Numbers recur with unusual consistency. Ratios appear embedded in architecture and art across unrelated cultures. Astronomical cycles are encoded into calendars long before precise instruments existed to verify them. These patterns do not require lost civilizations to explain them, but they do invite questions about transmission. How did such information travel, and what was lost along the way? Language itself preserves traces of forgetting. Words remain long after their referents disappear. Metaphors outlive the technologies that birthed them. We speak of turning the wheel without remembering what first turned. In ancient languages, technical terms persist stripped of context, repurposed as spiritual or poetic concepts. Meaning drifts, but structure remains. There is a quiet danger in over-literal reading of myth, just as there is danger in dismissing it entirely. To read myth as fact is to misunderstand its compression. To read it as fantasy is to ignore its function. Myth occupies a liminal space, neither record nor fiction but residue. It tells us less about what happened than about what could not be fully remembered. If earlier intelligences existed, their disappearance would have been experienced not as extinction, but as collapse. Survivors would not know what was lost in totality, only that something essential was gone. Their descendants would inherit stories of a brighter past without understanding its mechanics. Over generations, those stories would adapt to new contexts, shedding specificity while retaining emotional weight. This process explains why myths are often internally inconsistent. Timelines overlap, characters merge, events repeat with variation. These are not flaws, they are symptoms of oral compression. Multiple collapses blur into one. Multiple teachers merge into a single archetype. Precision yields to resonance. Modern discomfort with myth arises partly from its refusal to settle. It does not close questions, it sustains them. It resists verification because it was never designed to be verified. It was designed to endure, and endurance requires flexibility. A rigid story breaks, a malleable one survives. There is also the issue of authority. When myth becomes canonized, it stops being questioned. When it is desacralized, it stops being read carefully. In both cases, nuance is lost. The possibility that myth might encode distorted memory rather than moral instruction is rarely entertained seriously, because it threatens both religious certainty and secular confidence. Yet comparative mythology continues to reveal convergences that resist easy explanation. Similar narrative arcs emerge among cultures with no known contact. Similar symbols cluster around transitions, catastrophes, and knowledge transmission. These convergences do not demand a single origin. They demand acknowledgement of shared human responses to loss. Loss, when profound, seeks narrative form. It demands explanation even when explanation is impossible. Myth answers that demand not by clarifying the past, but by stabilizing the present. It offers continuity where evidence cannot. It says, something came before, something ended, and something remains. If intelligence arose earlier and was erased, myth would be its longest shadow. Not a photograph, not a blueprint, but a silhouette stretched across time. A suggestion rather than a statement. A reminder that memory does not require accuracy to persist. The danger lies in mistaking the shadow for the object, or in insisting that the shadow proves there was nothing casting it. Both positions close inquiry prematurely. Between them lies a quieter stance, to listen without concluding, to compare without collapsing difference, to allow myth to disturb certainty without replacing it. Perhaps myth is not asking to be believed. Perhaps it is asking to be read as what remains when explanation fails. If so, then its persistence across cultures is not evidence of shared fantasy, but of shared rupture. And if rupture is the common thread, then the stories we inherited may not be warnings about morality or obedience, but about fragility, about how easily worlds end, about how knowledge vanishes, about how those who come after mistake survival for beginning. If intelligence existed before, myth would not tell us how it lived. It would tell us how it was lost. And that, perhaps, is the only lesson capable of surviving the kind of forgetting that follows the end of an age. Intelligence is often described as an ascent, but biology does not move in straight lines. It wanders, it experiments, It overshoots and retreats. The fossil record reveals a branching confusion rather than a ladder, and within that confusion, cognition appears not as a destination, but as a temporary arrangement. Brains enlarge, reorganize, specialize, then sometimes shrink again. Capabilities appear, stabilize briefly, and then fade when circumstances change. This complicates the comforting narrative that intelligence was inevitable. If it were, the planet would be crowded with thinkers. Instead, complex cognition is rare, expensive, and unstable. It demands energy-rich environments, extended development, and social scaffolding. When any of these conditions weaken, intelligence becomes a liability. Simpler strategies outperform complexity. Awareness, once adaptive, becomes excess. Human evolution itself reflects this tension. Our lineage experimented repeatedly with brain expansion, tool use, and social complexity. Some branches persisted, others ended. There is no guarantee that the branch we inhabit was the only one capable of abstract thought. Nor is there assurance that earlier experiments did not reach cognitive thresholds we later recrossed, unaware. The speed at which modern human cognition crystallized remains a subject of debate. Symbolic behavior, art, and complex language appear in a relatively narrow window. Before that window, hominins existed for hundreds of thousands of years with comparatively modest technological change. Then something shifted. Explanations range from demographic pressure to neural rewiring to cultural feedback loops. Each explanation admits uncertainty. None fully accounts for the abruptness. Abrupt change invites speculation not because it proves intervention, but because it resists gradualism. Biology rarely accelerates without cause. Environmental stress can force innovation. Social density can amplify learning. But these mechanisms do not preclude earlier accelerations that fail to persist. A spike in intelligence that collapses leaves little trace beyond its absence. There is also the matter of selection. Intelligence is not selected for in isolation. It is selected for only when it increases reproductive success. A highly intelligent species that fails to adapt behaviorally to rapid climate shifts, resource scarcity, or ecological disruption may perish more readily than a less reflective competitor. In this light, intelligence is not the pinnacle of evolution. It is a gamble. This gamble may have been placed before. Species other than ours have demonstrated problem-solving, communication, and cultural transmission. Corvid's plan: cetaceans maintain social traditions. Primates manipulate symbols to limited degrees. These abilities did not converge into technological civilizations, but they demonstrate that cognition is not singular. It arises in degrees under different constraints. Imagine a lineage that developed abstract reasoning but lacked manipulative appendages suited for metallurgy, or one that favored aquatic environments where fire-based technologies were impractical, or one whose social structures limited cumulative knowledge beyond small groups. Intelligence could exist without leaving the signatures we expect. Minds could have flourished in forms incompatible with our assumptions. Even within humanity, cognition varies with environment. Skills emerge and fade according to need. Navigation abilities sharpen in seafaring cultures and dull when no longer required. Memory techniques flourish in oral societies and weaken when writing externalizes recall. Intelligence is not fixed. It is shaped continuously by context. This plasticity suggests that intelligence can disappear without extinction. A species may persist biologically while losing cognitive complexity. Brain size can reduce. Neural architecture can simplify. Knowledge can evaporate within generations if it no longer serves survival. Evolution does not mourn lost sophistication. It preserves only what functions. Over deep time, such losses would accumulate invisibly. A lineage might rise cognitively, collapse behaviorally, and continue in a diminished form, leaving behind no clear demarcation. Later observers would see continuity where rupture occurred. The absence of a clean break does not imply absence of loss. This possibility unsettles the way we interpret the past. We look for beginnings and endings, but biology offers transitions. We seek firsts, but evolution offers gradients. If intelligence waxes and wanes, then its previous peaks may be indistinguishable from plateaus, unless we know precisely what to look for. There is also the influence of chance. Genetic drift, bottlenecks, and founder effects reshape populations unpredictably. A catastrophe that spares only a small subset of a cognitively advanced population may erase most of its learned behavior in a single generation. Survivors rebuild with diminished tools, unaware of what was lost. Over time, this becomes the new normal. In such a scenario, intelligence is not inherited intact. It must be rediscovered. Each rediscovery feels unprecedented to those experiencing it. The past becomes irrelevant not because it did not exist, but because it cannot be accessed. Knowledge without continuity is indistinguishable from invention. This reframes human exceptionalism. We may not be the first to think abstractly. We may simply be the latest to succeed at maintaining the conditions that allow thinking to persist. Our technologies amplify memory. Our institutions stabilize transmission. Our networks preserve redundancy. These supports make intelligence visible and cumulative. Without them, cognition collapses inward. If earlier intelligences lacked such supports, or lost them through environmental upheaval, their disappearance would not register as a failure of biology, but as a failure of infrastructure. Minds would not vanish overnight. They would narrow, simplify, and adapt downward. Over generations, complexity would feel unnecessary, even burdensome. This idea challenges the assumption that intelligence leaves unmistakable marks. It suggests instead that intelligence can be ephemeral, flaring briefly and fading quietly, leaving behind a biological lineage that continues without awareness of its own former depth. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that intelligence is not self-preserving. It does not guarantee its own survival. It must be protected by conditions it does not control. When those conditions change, awareness recedes without protest. If so, then the emergence of intelligence is not a triumph over nature, but a temporary alignment with it. And if that alignment has occurred before, briefly, imperfectly, then the silence behind us is not evidence of emptiness, but of fragility. The question then shifts, not whether intelligence could have existed before, but whether intelligence, once arisen, ever truly understands how close it is to forgetting itself. The rocks remain silent not because nothing happened, but because stone remembers differently than minds do. Geology is often imagined as a reliable archive, yet it is an archive that prioritizes pressure, heat, and time over intention. It preserves layers, not stories. It records processes, not purposes. When we ask the ground to remember intelligence, we are asking it to perform a task it was never meant to fulfill. Most of the planet's surface is in constant motion. Plates collide, separate, dive beneath one another. Mountains rise and erode. Basins fill and empty. What remains visible at any moment is a temporary arrangement. The deeper record is fragmented, folded, and often destroyed outright. Entire chapters of Earth's surface have been recycled into the mantle, leaving no trace that they ever existed. This reality complicates the expectation that advanced societies would leave behind unmistakable geological scars. The Earth does not preserve cities the way museums do. It grinds them down, disperses their materials, and redistributes them across new contexts. After enough time, the signal of intention becomes indistinguishable from the noise of nature. Even dramatic human impacts struggle to persist. Mining scars soften, agricultural soils rewild, industrial pollutants disperse into background levels. The planet absorbs disturbance and smooths it out. Future geologists encountering our era without context might notice anomalies, but they would struggle to reconstruct the minds behind them. They would see effects without authors. This reframes the search for earlier intelligence. We look for obvious markers, roads, quarries, synthetic materials, because these are legible to us. But legibility is contextual. A geologist unfamiliar with biology might struggle to infer the existence of ancient forests from compressed coal. They would see carbon, not trees. In the same way, future observers might see altered chemistry without inferring thought. Some researchers have suggested that the most durable traces of technological activity are not structures, but chemical signatures. Unusual isotope ratios, persistent synthetic compounds, sudden shifts in sediment composition. These are subtle markers, easily misattributed to natural events unless one is specifically looking for intelligence. And even these markers fade with time. Consider how rare it is to preserve a moment. Fossils form only under exceptional conditions. Entire ecosystems vanish without leaving a single skeleton. The absence of fossils does not imply absence of life. It implies unfavourable preservation. By extension, the absence of technological traces does not imply absence of cognition. It implies that cognition does not fossilise easily. There is also a scale problem. A civilization need not be global to be intelligent. It need not alter the entire planet to be complex. A localised society, thriving for thousands of years in a stable region, could develop sophisticated knowledge without leaving global signatures. When that region is later submerged, subducted, or eroded, its story disappears with it. The expectation of planetary impact reflects modern experience rather than evolutionary necessity. Our civilization is global because of specific historical contingencies, energy density, fossil fuels, communication technologies. An earlier intelligence might have developed along a different trajectory, one that did not require planetary modification. Its footprint would be lighter, its erasure easier. Geology also teaches humility about rarity. Events that seem exceptional in human terms, supervolcanoes, massive impacts, are routine over deep time. The Earth has endured countless upheavals that would obliterate any surface-bound society. To expect survival through such events is to misunderstand scale. There is a quiet irony here. The more advanced a society becomes, the more vulnerable it often is to disruption. Complexity breeds dependency. Systems interlock. Failures cascade. A small perturbation can trigger collapse. Simpler systems, though less capable, endure longer. They bend rather than break. If intelligence arose earlier, it may have reached a level of complexity that proved unsustainable under shifting conditions. Its collapse would leave behind not monuments, but gaps. A sudden simplification in material culture. A narrowing of ecological impact. A return to less specialised forms. These transitions might appear gradual in the rock record, even if they were abrupt in lived experience. This creates a paradox. The very traits we associate with intelligence, planning, specialization, abstraction, may reduce the likelihood of long-term geological visibility. Intelligence optimizes for efficiency, not permanence. It solves immediate problems, not future archaeology. When we demand proof in stone, we impose our criteria retroactively. We ask the past to conform to our expectations of evidence. But evidence is shaped by survival, not significance. What mattered most to those who lived is often what disappears first. The silence of the rocks, then, is not a verdict. It is a condition. It tells us that the planet is not obligated to preserve intention. It preserves only what happens to align with its own processes. To read intelligence into geology requires patience, restraint, and acceptance of ambiguity. Some anomalies persist, layers that shift too quickly, chemical changes that resist easy explanation, patterns that suggest sudden reorganization. These anomalies do not announce intelligence. They whisper disruption. They say something changed, not why. Interpretation fills the gap. But interpretation is shaped by what we believe is possible. If earlier intelligences existed, their disappearance would register geologically as absence rather than presence. A world that could have been altered but was not. A plateau where one might expect continuity but finds interruption. These negative spaces are difficult to argue from. They are easily ignored, yet absence itself can be informative. In biology, missing lineages tell stories. In astronomy, missing mass implies unseen forces. In history, missing records suggest erasure. The challenge lies in recognizing when absence is meaningful rather than trivial. Geology does not tell us that intelligence never existed before. It tells us that if it did, it was not favored by preservation. It tells us that the Earth is indifferent to minds, that awareness leaves no guaranteed imprint, that time, given enough of it, makes all intentions look natural. This realization does not close the question. It sharpens it. It shifts the burden from finding proof to understanding limits. What can we reasonably expect to survive? What signals would be subtle enough to endure without being obvious? What traces would intelligence leave if it did not expect to be remembered? Perhaps the most honest answer is that we do not yet know how to ask these questions properly. Our methods are tuned to our own experience. Our expectations are shaped by our own artifacts. To search for earlier intelligence using only the tools of recent history is to listen for whispers with ears trained for shouting. The rocks are not mute. They simply speak a language we're still learning to interpret. And until we learn it more fully, silence should not be mistaken for denial. There is a peculiar reverence embedded in ancient observations of the sky. Early cultures did not merely look upward. They oriented their lives around celestial cycles with a seriousness that borders on devotion. The movements of stars, the slow drift of constellations, the rhythm of solstices and equinoxes, these were not curiosities. They were anchors. Time itself was measured against the heavens, as if the sky remembered something the earth had forgotten. What unsettles modern readers is not that ancient people observed the sky, but how precisely they did so. Astronomical knowledge appears fully articulated in places where supporting infrastructure seems absent. Long cycles are tracked with accuracy that demands sustained observation across generations. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over tens of thousands of years, enters mythological frameworks long before it is formally described. The question is not whether such knowledge is possible, but how it was preserved. Precision requires continuity. To notice slow celestial shifts, one must compare records separated by centuries. To encode them meaningfully, one must possess both mathematical abstraction and symbolic transmission. These are not casual achievements. They suggest institutional memory, systems designed to carry information forward intact. And yet, in many cases, the cultures credited with this knowledge appear later than the knowledge itself. This dislocation produces a subtle tension. Knowledge seems to precede its custodians. Early civilizations often describe themselves not as originators, but as inheritors. Their texts speak of wisdom received, restored, or remembered. The golden ages lie behind them, not ahead. Innovation is framed as recovery. Progress is imagined as return. Modern interpretations often recast this language as metaphor. But metaphor itself is revealing. It reflects how people understood their relationship to knowledge. To imagine wisdom as ancient is to imagine oneself as late. It is to locate authority in the past rather than the future. This orientation is difficult to reconcile with a linear, progressive view of history. Astronomy, more than any other field, resists improvisation. The sky does not respond to belief. Its patterns must be learned, not invented. If ancient cultures encoded accurate celestial information, they did so through disciplined observation. The question is not whether they were capable, but whether they were alone in that capability. Some calendars track cycles longer than a human lifetime. Some monuments align with celestial events that occur infrequently, requiring foresight or inherited instruction. These alignments are often explained as the product of cumulative tradition. That explanation is plausible, but it assumes unbroken transmission. It assumes that knowledge survived every disruption intact. Yet disruption is the rule, not the exception. Societies collapse, languages die, records vanish. Under such conditions, how does long-term astronomical knowledge persist? One answer is ritualization. When information becomes sacred, it is preserved even when its meaning fades. Calendars become ceremonies, alignments become shrines. The knowledge survives, but as form rather than function. This transformation suggests inheritance without understanding, a system maintained because it matters, not because it is understood. Over time, explanation is replaced by repetition. Precision persists, but rationale dissolves. The sky remains accurate, the story around it changes. There is also the question of global convergence. Independent cultures tracked similar cycles, named similar patterns and oriented structures in comparable ways. This does not require a shared origin, but it does suggest shared priorities. The sky, after all, is the same everywhere, but the methods of encoding its motion vary. Similar solutions emerging independently is possible, but the recurrence of certain symbolic frameworks invites pause. Ancient cosmologies often describe earlier ages in which humans were closer to the heavens, more attuned, more knowledgeable. These ages end abruptly. The sky becomes distant. Knowledge becomes fragmented. Astronomy shifts from lived orientation to specialized study. The cosmos recedes into abstraction. This narrative arc mirrors the broader theme of loss. Knowledge of the heavens becomes something remembered rather than embodied. It moves from everyday life into texts, from ritual into calculation. The sky remains, but the relationship changes. If earlier intelligences existed, astronomy would have been among their most durable legacies, not because it fossilizes, but because it can be rediscovered. The sky resets itself nightly. Its patterns endure beyond collapse. A later culture, inheriting fragments of astronomical knowledge, might reconstruct systems without knowing their origin. The sky would feel ancient because it is. This raises a subtle possibility that some ancient astronomical frameworks are palimpsests, layers of observation laid atop earlier layers, each generation adding, subtracting, reinterpreting. Over time, origin becomes indistinguishable from refinement. The first observers disappear behind the accumulation of tradition. The danger lies in assuming that attribution equals authorship. Just because a culture preserved a system does not mean it created it. Custodianship can masquerade as invention, especially when memory fails. History tends to credit the last holder of knowledge, not its first. There is also an emotional dimension. To believe that wisdom comes from the past is to feel diminished. To believe it comes from oneself is empowering. Modern narratives prefer empowerment. They frame ancient achievement as ingenuity rather than inheritance. This preference shapes interpretation as much as evidence does. Yet the sky remains indifferent to narrative. It continues its cycles, patient and precise. It offers the same information now as it did thousands of years ago. What changes is our willingness to listen, and our assumptions about who listened first. If intelligence arose earlier, its astronomical legacy would not announce itself as alien or impossible. It would feel familiar, almost too familiar. It would appear as knowledge that fits too comfortably, as if remembered rather than discovered. This familiarity would make it easy to overlook, to attribute to coincidence or brilliance rather than continuity. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that some of what we consider the dawn of a knowledge may actually be twilight, light borrowed from an earlier sun. If so, then our relationship to the sky is not new, it is resumed. And if we are resuming rather than beginning, then the question shifts again. Not whether the heavens were studied before us, but how many times their lessons were learned, forgotten, and learned again, each time believed to be the first? The stars do not answer this question. They simply continue to move, marking time without regard for who is watching, and in that movement lies a quiet reminder. Knowledge does not belong to any one age. It waits, repeating itself patiently, until someone is able and willing to remember. Forgetting is not always accidental. Sometimes it is structured, encouraged, even rewarded. As societies grow, they develop mechanisms for deciding what matters enough to be preserved. These mechanisms are rarely neutral. They favour coherence over contradiction, stability over uncertainty, narratives that justify the present rather than complicate it. Over time, this selective memory hardens into tradition, and tradition into authority. Institutions emerge to guard knowledge, but also to filter it. What is taught is what can be standardized. What is repeated is what can be defended. Ambiguity becomes a liability. Questions without answers threaten legitimacy. And so history is shaped not only by what happened, but by what is allowed to be remembered. This process does not require secrecy or conspiracy. It operates through incentives. Scholars are trained within frameworks that reward consistency. Funding follows consensus. Education simplifies complexity to ensure transmission. Over generations, the boundaries of acceptable inquiry narrow, not because alternatives are false, but because they are inconvenient. When anomalies arise, they are contextualized until they no longer feel disruptive. An artifact becomes an exception. A myth becomes metaphor. A gap becomes coincidence. Each individual decision feels reasonable. Collectively, they produce amnesia. Not a dramatic erasure, but a gradual smoothing of the past until it fits comfortably within expectation. There are moments in history when this process becomes visible. Periods of consolidation often coincide with periods of forgetting. Libraries are curated, texts are copied selectively, interpretations are standardized. Competing chronologies are harmonized or discarded. What survives is not necessarily what was most accurate, but what was most compatible. Religious institutions provide one example, but they are not unique. Empires do the same. Scientific paradigms do the same. Any system that relies on shared assumptions must protect those assumptions. This protection often takes the form of skepticism toward ideas that destabilize origin stories. The idea that intelligence could have existed before humanity destabilizes more than chronology. It destabilizes hierarchy. It challenges the notion of progress as ascent. It reframes modernity not as culmination, but as recurrence. Such reframing threatens the authority of those who claim to interpret the beginning. As a result, alternative timelines are often treated with disproportionate suspicion. The burden of proof becomes impossibly high. Evidence must be extraordinary to overcome institutional inertia. Meanwhile, the absence of evidence expected under deep time is treated as decisive. This asymmetry ensures that dominant narratives persist even when incomplete. There is also a pedagogical dimension. History, as taught, prioritizes clarity. It favors clean transitions and identifiable beginnings. Complexity is trimmed to fit curricula. Nuance is postponed indefinitely. Students learn what can be tested, not what can be questioned. Over time, this produces confidence without curiosity. This confidence becomes self-reinforcing. Once a narrative is widely accepted, alternatives feel fringe regardless of their merit. To entertain them risks association with speculation rather than scholarship. The social cost of curiosity rises. Silence becomes safer than inquiry. Yet suppression is rarely total. Questions leak through in marginal disciplines, in interdisciplinary spaces, in the gaps between established fields. Geologists notice anomalies, archaeologists cannot explain. Linguists encounter patterns that resist historical placement. Astronomers recognize knowledge embedded where it should not be. These observations rarely converge, because convergence itself requires permission. The fragmentation of modern knowledge exacerbates this problem. Specialization creates expertise, but it also creates isolation. Insights that require synthesis struggle to find institutional homes. Questions that cross boundaries are deferred indefinitely. The past remains partitioned, its contradictions unresolved. There is a quiet irony here. The more advanced a knowledge system becomes, the harder it is for it to revise its foundations. Complexity breeds rigidity. Foundational assumptions become load-bearing. To question them feels dangerous, even when evidence invites reconsideration. This does not mean history is deliberately falsified. It means it is curated. Curated histories are not lies. They are stories with edges trimmed. What falls outside the frame is not denied. It is ignored. Over time, ignored becomes forgotten. Forgotten becomes impossible. If earlier intelligences existed, their memory would not need to be erased intentionally. It would fade naturally as frameworks solidified around alternative explanations. The past would be simplified to protect the present. Questions would be reframed until they no longer pointed backward. The most enduring form of suppression is normalization. When a narrative is repeated long enough, it stops feeling like a narrative. It becomes reality. Alternatives begin to sound strange not because they are implausible, but because they are unfamiliar. Familiarity replaces evidence as the metric of truth. And yet the unease remains. It surfaces whenever anomalies accumulate faster than they can be explained away, whenever myths align too closely with geological disruption, whenever knowledge appears fully formed without lineage. These moments do not overturn history, but they strain it. Perhaps the greatest danger is not that we have forgotten something important, but that we have forgotten how to remember differently, that we have mistaken coherence for completeness, that we have learned to resolve tension too quickly. If intelligence arose before, its disappearance would not only be geological or biological, it would be epistemic. The ways of knowing that could recognize it would have to survive as well. Without them, evidence becomes invisible even when present. This suggests that rediscovery, if it ever occurs, will not come from a single artifact or breakthrough. It will come from a shift in posture, from certainty to curiosity, from defense to listening. It will require comfort with questions that do not resolve neatly. History does not need to be rewritten to accommodate this possibility. It needs to be loosened, allowed to breathe, permitted to hold gaps without rushing to fill them. In those gaps, the past may still be speaking. And if institutions have taught us to listen only for answers, then the most radical act may be to listen for uncertainty instead. Because uncertainty is not ignorance. It is the space where memory might return, quietly, incompletely, and without permission. When cultures are compared side by side, patterns begin to surface that resist simple diffusion or coincidence. Measurements recur, shapes repeat, motifs echo across distances too vast for easy contact. The similarities are rarely exact, yet they feel related, like variations on a theme remembered imperfectly. Comparative study does not prove a shared origin, but it does reveal shared constraints, shared questions, and perhaps shared inheritances. Architecture provides one of the clearest lenses. Across continents, early monumental structures favour similar forms, massive stone blocks, precise alignments, emphasis on horizontality and cardinal direction. These choices are often explained by functional necessity or symbolic convergence. Stone lasts, orientation matters, gravity is universal, all true. And yet, the recurrence of specific ratios, angles, and construction logics invites closer attention. Certain proportions appear again and again, embedded in structures with no known connection. These proportions are not required for stability, yet they persist. They are aesthetically restrained, mathematically elegant, and oddly conservative. innovation seems less important than preservation. Builders reproduce patterns rather than inventing new ones, as if fidelity matters more than originality. This fidelity extends beyond architecture. Counting systems, calendrical divisions, and symbolic numerologies recur across cultures separated by oceans. Numbers acquire meaning not merely as quantities but as structures of reality. Cycles are favoured over linear progressions. Time is segmented into repeating phases rather than singular trajectories. These frameworks feel ancient even within ancient societies, as though inherited rather than conceived. Language, too, preserves echoes. Certain root metaphors recur in unrelated tongues. Ski as order, earth as memory, water as erasure. These metaphors are not universal by necessity. They are universal by persistence. They suggest shared experiential pressures rather than shared vocabulary. When many cultures imagine the past as higher, brighter, or more complete, the metaphor begins to feel less arbitrary. Comparative mythology reinforces this impression. Civilizing figures appear with similar attributes across regions. They bring law, agriculture, measurement, and astronomy. They depart or disappear, often after conflict or catastrophe. Their absence marks the beginning of decline. These figures are not identical, but they occupy similar narrative roles. They function as bridges between a lost past and a diminished present. Skeptics rightly caution against overinterpretation. Humans share cognitive biases. We notice patterns even when none exist. Independent invention is common. Similar problems invite similar solutions. Yet the cumulative weight of these correspondences strains pure coincidence, not because any single parallel is decisive, but because the parallels cluster around knowledge that implies long-term continuity. One explanation is cultural inheritance across deep time, fragmented and reassembled through repeated collapse. Another is that certain knowledge, once discovered, tends to re-emerge because it fits the structure of reality efficiently. Both explanations can coexist. What matters is that these patterns suggest memory operating without clear lineage. This memory does not behave like a textbook. It behaves like sediment. Layers accumulate unevenly. Some compress, some erode. Later layers press down on earlier ones, obscuring them without eliminating them entirely. When pressure shifts, older layers resurface in distorted form. Comparative study is the act of tracing these distortions back towards something shared. There is also the possibility that shared patterns reflect shared loss. When societies rebuild after collapse, they may gravitate toward familiar structures remembered dimly. Certain forms feel right, without explanation. Certain orientations feel necessary even when their original rationale is forgotten. The past guides reconstruction not through instruction, but through intuition. This intuition can harden into tradition. Once a form is repeated often enough, it becomes canonical. Deviations feel wrong, even when functionally equivalent. Over time, tradition disguises inheritance as identity. A culture believes a pattern belongs to it because it has always used it, unaware that always may be shorter than it feels. Comparative analysis also reveals what is missing. Some cultures preserve advanced techniques in isolation, without the surrounding systems that would normally support them. Knowledge appears unbalanced, highly developed in one domain, absent in others. This asymmetry suggests partial inheritance rather than full innovation. Pieces remain without the whole. Modern disciplines struggle with this fragmentation because they prefer closed systems. Archaeology, linguistics, astronomy, and anthropology each tell partial stories. When those stories overlap imperfectly, the temptation is to resolve contradictions by narrowing scope. What cannot be explained within a discipline is often left unexplored rather than integrated. Yet integration is where the discomfort lives. It is where similarities stop feeling incidental and start feeling suggestive. It is where the idea of repeated inheritance becomes plausible, not as a single lost civilization, but as a recurring process of forgetting and rediscovery. This reframes the question of uniqueness. Humanity may not be unique in its intelligence, but in its timing. We may occupy a moment where multiple inherited fragments align, astronomy rediscovered, mathematics formalized, memory externalized through writing and technology. This alignment creates the illusion of novelty. It feels unprecedented because the pieces have not aligned like this before, at least not within memory. But alignment is fragile. It depends on stability, communication, and restraint. Without these, fragments scatter again. Knowledge returns to myth. Precision returns to ritual. The cycle resets without announcement. Comparative patterns do not confirm earlier intelligences. They suggest continuity without clarity. They hint at something remembered imperfectly, shared unevenly, and protected unconsciously. They challenge the assumption that similarity requires contact or coincidence alone. Perhaps the most unsettling implication is that human culture may be less original than it believes, that what we call tradition is often inheritance without acknowledgement, that what we call innovation may be reassembly. If so, then the past is not distant. It is layered beneath us, influencing choices we do not recognize as echoes. Our symbols, measurements, and stories may carry residues of earlier minds, not as messages, but as habits. And habits, once established, are difficult to trace to their beginnings. They feel natural, they feel inevitable, they feel like the way things have always been. If intelligence existed before, it may not have left us instructions, it may have left us preferences, subtle biases towards certain forms of order, certain ways of counting time, certain orientations toward the sky. These preferences would survive collapse more easily than explicit knowledge. In that sense, comparative culture does not reveal a lost world. It reveals a continuity of longing for order, for orientation, for memory. It suggests that even when knowledge vanishes, the shape of knowledge remains. And if the shape remains, then perhaps the past is not asking to be proven. It is asking to be recognized, in the patterns we repeat without knowing why, and in the questions that feel older than the answers we give them. Certainty carries an ethical weight rarely acknowledged. It simplifies decision-making, stabilizes identity, and protects institutions from paralysis. But certainty also closes doors. When a narrative hardens into fact, curiosity becomes transgression. Questions feel like threats rather than invitations. History, once settled, begins to police itself. This policing does not announce its presence. It emerges as tone, as impatience with ambiguity, as a subtle narrowing of what is considered reasonable to ask. Over time, certainty acquires a moral dimension. To doubt is to undermine, to speculate is to distract, to reopen origins is to risk dissolving meaning. The danger here is not error, but stagnation. A closed history cannot adapt to new evidence because adaptation implies instability. When identity is anchored to a particular beginning, alternative beginnings feel like erasure. They threaten not only chronology, but belonging. Humanity's confidence in being first carries this weight. It frames intelligence as a singular achievement, a culmination rather than a phase. It assigns responsibility and privilege simultaneously. We become stewards of awareness because we believe we invented it. This belief comforts and burdens in equal measure. But comfort can be deceptive. When certainty replaces inquiry, it breeds fragility. A story that cannot tolerate revision is vulnerable to collapse when revision becomes unavoidable. The past then becomes a battlefield rather than a resource. Philosophers have long warned against mistaking explanation for truth. Explanations are tools, not destinations. They help us navigate complexity, but they are not complexity itself. When explanations become sacred, they cease to function. They stop asking and start defending. Dart. The idea that intelligence could have existed before humanity threatens sacred explanation. It destabilizes linear progress. It reframes modernity as iteration. It invites humility where pride has settled. This invitation is often refused not because it lacks merit, but because it feels unsafe. Safety, in this context, is psychological. To imagine predecessors is to imagine failure. If others rose and fell, so might we. If intelligence is fragile, then our own permanence is uncertain. Certainty shields us from this discomfort by declaring the question resolved. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that resolution is provisional. What feels settled in one era becomes questionable in another. What feels impossible becomes mundane. The danger lies not in being wrong, but in refusing to be corrected. Ethically, this refusal matters. A civilization that believes itself unprecedented may treat the future differently than one that sees itself as a caretaker of a recurring phenomenon. The former may prioritize expansion and extraction, assuming novelty grants permission. The latter may prioritize preservation, aware of collapse. The question of earlier intelligence is therefore not merely academic, it shapes values. It influences how societies imagine their relationship to time. Are we pioneers on an empty stage, or participants in a long unfinished play? The answer alters responsibility. There is also an ethical dimension to dismissal. When alternative interpretations are ridiculed rather than examined, inquiry is discouraged. This discouragement does not eliminate speculation, it drives it underground. Questions persist without guidance, attracting certainty of a different kind, dogmatic belief rather than cautious doubt. Healthy skepticism requires space. It requires acknowledging uncertainty without rushing to fill it. It requires admitting when evidence is incomplete without declaring the inquiry illegitimate. This balance is difficult but necessary. History, when open, functions as a dialogue across time. When closed, it becomes a monologue. Monologues are efficient, but they are brittle. They cannot respond to interruption. They cannot integrate new voices. If earlier intelligences existed, the ethical failure would not be forgetting them. Forgetting is natural. The failure would be refusing to consider the possibility once evidence and pattern invite it. The failure would be prioritizing comfort over curiosity. There is also humility in recognizing limits. Our tools are recent. Our methods are young. Our perspective is narrow in time. To declare finality under these conditions is not confidence. It is impatience. Patience, by contrast, allows uncertainty to mature. It allows patterns to emerge slowly. It tolerates incomplete answers. It treats the past as a landscape rather than a map. This posture does not abandon rigor, it deepens it. The ethical challenge, then, is to resist premature closure, to allow the question of earlier intelligence to remain open without letting it harden into belief, to explore without concluding, to speculate without insisting. This posture mirrors the very intelligence we seek to understand. Intelligence thrives on flexibility. It adapts, revises, and learns. When it becomes rigid, it fails. Perhaps the same is true of historical intelligence, the collective mind that interprets the past. If humanity insists on being first, it risks becoming last. Not because of punishment or fate, but because certainty dulls adaptation. A species that believes it has reached the summit may stop climbing, unaware that the terrain still shifts beneath its feet. The ethical danger is subtle. It hides behind confidence and pride. It disguises itself as realism. But realism without humility becomes dogma. Dogma resists correction, and resistance, over time, becomes collapse. There is a quieter ethic available, one that values openness over resolution. It treats history as provisional. It welcomes anomaly as information rather than inconvenience. It recognizes that being wrong is not failure, but participation in a longer conversation. If intelligence arose before, we do not owe it reverence or nostalgia. We owe it attention, not because it defines us, but because it reminds us of fragility, of cycles, of the ease with which knowledge vanishes. Ethics, in this sense, is not about honouring the past, it is about protecting the future. A civilization aware of recurrence may act with restraint. A civilization convinced of uniqueness may act with abandon. The choice between these postures is not dictated by evidence alone, it is dictated by values, by what we are willing to risk questioning, by how much uncertainty we can tolerate without rushing to certainty. Perhaps the most ethical stance is not to decide whether intelligence existed before, but to allow the possibility to reshape our behaviour regardless, to act as if awareness is fragile, to treat knowledge as temporary, to build systems that remember even when we forget. If earlier minds looked forward, they may have hoped for continuity. If they failed, the failure was not moral, it was structural. But we, knowing that failure is possible, face a different responsibility. The past does not ask us to believe in it. It asks us to learn from the fact that belief is not enough to survive. Only attentiveness is, and if attentiveness begins with doubt, then doubt may be the most ethical inheritance we can accept. Quiet, unresolved, and unwilling to close the question that keeps intelligence awake. Inheritance rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with labels or acknowledgements. It settles quietly into habits, assumptions, and frameworks that feel self-evident. When a civilization believes it is original, it often fails to notice what it has inherited, not because the inheritance is hidden, but because it feels natural. To imagine humanity as an inheritor rather than an origin requires a subtle shift in perspective. It asks us to see our achievements not as isolated breakthroughs, but as assemblies, pieces gathered from different times, different pressures, different failures. Some pieces we shaped ourselves. Others may have arrived already worn smooth by earlier use. This does not diminish human ingenuity, it reframes it. Assembly is not lesser than invention. In many ways, it is more difficult. It requires recognition, selection, and integration. It requires knowing what to keep and what to discard. A civilization that assembles well can appear suddenly sophisticated, even if its components are ancient. There is a quiet consistency in how early cultures describe their knowledge. Laws are received, calendars are restored, measurements are remembered. The language of inheritance persists even when the mechanics are unclear. Modern readers often reinterpret this language as symbolic humility or theological framing. Yet it may also reflect genuine uncertainty about origin. Consider how often ancient societies attribute foundational knowledge to predecessors whose nature is ambiguous. They are not always gods in the modern sense. They are ancestors, watchers, teachers, figures who belong to a time before time. Their role is not to create the world, but to explain it. They arrive after disruption, bringing order rather than novelty. This narrative pattern aligns uncomfortably well with the idea of survival after collapse. Survivors do not invent from nothing. They salvage, they reconstruct, they reinterpret fragments whose original context is gone. Over generations, the source of those fragments fades, leaving only reverence. Inheritance also explains asymmetry. Why some early cultures excelled in astronomy but not metallurgy. Why others mastered stonework but left little evidence of writing. Knowledge may have arrived unevenly, preserved where it fit existing needs and lost where it did not. Inheritance does not distribute itself evenly. It adapts to local conditions. Modern civilization exhibits similar patterns. We inherit technologies without understanding their foundations. We use systems we did not design. We trust mechanisms too complex for any individual to grasp fully. Our confidence comes not from comprehension, but from reliability. If it works, we accept it. If this is true now, it could have been true before. Earlier intelligences may have inherited knowledge from even earlier ones, creating chains of partial memory stretching back beyond recognition. Each link simplifies, adapts, and forgets, until origin becomes irrelevant. The idea of layered inheritance challenges linear history. It suggests that progress may not move forward cleanly, but sideways, looping back on itself. Innovations may reappear not because they are new, but because conditions align to make them useful again. Discovery becomes rediscovery without awareness. There is also a psychological comfort in believing we began everything ourselves. It grants ownership. It places humanity at the center of meaning. Inheriting, by contrast, implies obligation. It suggests that what we possess was borrowed, not earned. Borrowed things come with responsibility. If humanity is an inheritor, then the ruins we study are not merely remnants of our own ancestors, but echoes of something older. The stone beneath our monuments may have been shaped before our languages existed. The alignments we admire may have been refined rather than conceived. Our awe may be directed at craftsmanship whose origin we cannot name. This possibility reframes humility. Humility is not self-denial, it is accuracy. It recognizes scale. It acknowledges that intelligence is larger than any single species or era. It situates humanity within a continuum rather than above it. Continuums, however, resist closure. They do not offer clean beginnings or definitive endings. They blur responsibility across time. This blurring can feel unsettling. It complicates narratives of destiny and progress. It introduces uncertainty where confidence once stood. Yet uncertainty may be the most honest posture available. The deeper we look into the past, the less final our conclusions become. Evidence fragments, timelines stretch, assumptions loosen. Certainty gives way to probability. Probability gives way to humility. If earlier intelligences existed, they may not have intended to leave legacies. Legacy requires foresight beyond survival. It requires belief in continuity. A civilization facing collapse may prioritize preservation of life over preservation of memory. Knowledge that cannot be carried becomes expendable. This does not mean nothing was passed on. It means what was passed on was filtered by necessity. Stories travel more easily than schematics. Symbols endure where instructions fail. Preferences survive where explanations vanish. Inheritance becomes subtle. Subtle inheritance is difficult to detect because it does not stand apart from culture. It becomes culture. By the time we notice it, it feels inseparable from identity. Questioning it feels like self-doubt rather than curiosity. Perhaps this is why the idea of prior intelligence feels threatening. It implies that what we call human may be less autonomous than we believe. That some of our most cherished frameworks may not be exclusively ours. That originality is rarer than continuity. Yet continuity does not erase meaning, it deepens it. To inherit is to participate in a longer story. To recognize inheritance is to acknowledge that intelligence is not confined to one moment. It flows, adapts, and sometimes disappears. If humanity is living among the ruins of earlier cognition, then our task is not to prove that cognition existed. It is to ask what allowed it to vanish, what vulnerabilities it could not overcome, what assumptions failed it. These questions are forward-looking, even when rooted in the past. They ask how intelligence persists, not how it begins. They shift focus from origin to maintenance, from discovery to stewardship. Inheritance also reframes hope. If intelligence has arisen before, then its emergence is not a miracle, but a pattern. Patterns can recur, but patterns also warn. They show what happens when conditions break. Perhaps the most unsettling inheritance is not knowledge, but silence. The absence of voices from before suggests that intelligence does not guarantee remembrance, that awareness can vanish completely, leaving no testimony of its own existence. If that is so, then the future does not owe us memory. The planet does not promise continuity. What remains depends on what we build not just in matter, but in resilience. To see ourselves as inheritors is to see ourselves as temporary custodians of awareness, not its owners, not its originators. custodians who must decide whether this cycle ends with us or continues quietly into a time we will never see. And if that decision is shaped by how we understand the past, then perhaps the most important inheritance is not knowledge itself, but the willingness to imagine that knowledge can be lost and to act accordingly. In the longest view, intelligence does not appear as a triumph carved into stone, but as a brief illumination moving across deep darkness. It rises quietly, organizes the world around itself for a time, and then, almost without announcement, dims. What remains is not evidence of brilliance, but evidence of forgetting. Silence where voices once argued, landscapes where choices were once made. If intelligence has risen before, its most enduring lesson may not be technical or architectural. It may be structural. It may reveal not how to build, but how easily building collapses. Not how knowledge is discovered, but how effortlessly it slips beyond reach when continuity breaks. The Earth offers no sentimentality in this regard. It does not preserve intention. It does not honour awareness. It does not distinguish between a mountain formed by blind pressure and a monument raised by thought. Given time, both are reduced to sediment. Meaning is not a geological category. This indifference is unsettling only because we expect otherwise. We imagine intelligence as something that should matter to the universe, something that should leave a scar deep enough to be unmistakable. But the universe does not operate on should. It operates on process, and process erases without preference. Perhaps this is why the idea of prior intelligence feels haunting rather than reassuring. It suggests that awareness is not protected by its own importance, that knowing does not confer immunity. That insight, no matter how profound, can vanish without trace. If earlier minds once looked out at their world with understanding, they may have believed, as we do now, that what they built would endure, that what they knew would be carried forward, that intelligence once achieved would not be easily undone. These beliefs are not foolish, they are human. And yet, belief does not preserve. Only structure does, only redundancy, only restraint. Intelligence that expands faster than it stabilizes leaves itself exposed. Intelligence that values growth over memory becomes brittle. Intelligence that forgets its dependence on environment mistakes control for permanence. The silence behind us may be the consequence of such mistakes, or simply of bad luck. Catastrophe does not ask whether its victims were wise. It does not test foresight. It resets indiscriminately. In its wake, survivors inherit a world stripped of context, where fragments feel miraculous simply because they remain. What follows is not rebirth, but adaptation. Minds narrow their focus. Memory contracts. Immediate survival eclipses abstract continuity. Knowledge becomes local, then mythic, then symbolic. Over generations, the idea that something greater once existed begins to feel implausible, then unnecessary. Eventually, a new intelligence rises, believing itself alone. This cycle does not imply failure in a moral sense, it implies limits. Intelligence is not outside nature, it is an expression of it, and nature does not privilege awareness over other outcomes. It allows complexity, but it does not safeguard it. Seen this way, the question of whether humanity was the first intelligent species becomes less important than what intelligence does with the time it has. If others came before and vanished, their absence is not a rebuke, it is a warning written in negative space. The warning is quiet. It does not announce dates or causes. It simply suggests that intelligence is temporary unless deliberately protected. That memory requires architecture beyond stone. That continuity must be chosen repeatedly, especially when conditions make forgetting easier. There is a temptation to end such reflections with urgency, with a call to preserve, to act, to change course. But urgency belongs to moments, not to deep time. Deep time responds only to patterns. It remembers not intentions but outcomes. If intelligence is to persist, It must learn to value what does not advance quickly. Patience, redundancy, humility, the ability to carry knowledge even when it offers no immediate advantage, the willingness to preserve stories whose relevance is not yet clear. Perhaps earlier intelligences lacked these traits, or perhaps they possessed them and were still erased. The difference may not matter. What matters is recognizing that intelligence alone is insufficient. It must be coupled with care for memory, care for limits, care for the systems that allow thought to outlive thinkers. The past does not offer us heroes or villains in this regard. It offers only absence. And absence, when examined honestly, is instructive. It shows us what happens when no one remains to remember. In that absence, we are free to imagine predecessors not as gods or lost masters, but as mirrors, beings who faced similar questions, made similar assumptions, and trusted in similar continuities. Their silence does not accuse us. It contextualizes us. If we are not the first, then being the last becomes a possibility worth contemplating, not as doom, but as responsibility. Responsibility to build intelligence that does not depend solely on uninterrupted growth. Responsibility to imagine futures where memory survives disruption. The Earth will continue regardless. It will host life in some form. It will reshape itself patiently. Intelligence may return even if it disappears. But whether that intelligence remembers us depends on choices that feel small now and immense only in retrospect. The quiet warning is not that collapse is inevitable. It is that forgetting is easy, that certainty accelerates erasure, that humility slows it. Perhaps the most enduring form of intelligence is not what knows the most, but what remembers that knowing can end. What plans not only for expansion, but for interruption. What builds not just monuments, but margins. In the end, the question of who came first dissolves into something more delicate. Not who awakened first, but who learned how to remain awake without assuming the dawn would last forever. And as the night stretches on, and the past recedes into layers we can no longer separate, one thought lingers with unusual weight. That intelligence may not be defined by its brilliance, but by whether it leaves behind a world capable of remembering that it once existed,